Ordinals already had the fastest growing Discord server in history before any digital assets company covered it post mainnet launch, which to me is like mind-blowing. Like, who was asleep at the wheel? You know what I mean? Like, who was like not paying attention, right?
Welcome to Beyond the Beat, a podcast by Chain Story, the agency to elevate your status in crypto. I'm your host, Pedro, and every week I'll be talking to the people in crypto media. We'll be telling their stories, their failures, their lessons, and whatever tips or tricks they've got up their sleeves.
Isabel, Foxen, thank you so much for coming.
My pleasure. I'm thrilled. What an awesome opportunity to talk about the digital assets media landscape. So thank you for having me.
Yeah, I'd love if you could just tell me a little bit about your prehistory in crypto, like what you drew you to the space, and if you could give us an intro about what sort of relationship you have with crypto media, crypto communications, that whole sort of intro side of things.
I'm happy to. So when I was quite young, I was in my early 20s, and this was like when Instagram first started. It was literally like the early days of Instagram. I remember like setting up an Instagram account because I was starting a business. And I was life coaching at the time. I was like starting a life coaching business, and it was the beginning of online marketing. It was, setting up an Instagram account for the first time, and I started a blog, and I was, I was living in New York at the time, and so I would go to the parties where, my sort of wellness peeps were hanging out and try to meet media people and guest post for, Huffington Post wellness section and those types of publications. And I did really well. My blog kind of blew up, and I ran that business for over a decade. And that was essentially an online marketing business where I was selling, wellness education products.
What year was this?
This started in 2011.
Okay.
Yeah, so this is a long time.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. But this was like the beginning of internet marketing, right? I mean, I think anyone who's been in online marketing long enough will tell you that the two industries that basically defined and invented online marketing were the diet industry and porn, right? I mean, those two industries they're always at the cutting edge. And gambling. And gambling is the other one, right? I mean, the clickbaity, right, type, the ultimate degen industries, really. And so... yeah, so I was sort of like tangential diet industry, right? It was like the beginning of like the health and wellness online marketing world. And I did really well in that world and had my own company in that world for about 10 years. I was all, selling products and services through online marketing. So I got really pretty good, pretty sophisticated with online marketing hacking, if you will. But I was getting bored of the subject matter, right? It's like, how long can you talk about one thing over and over again? I was like, okay, I'm over this now. I don't really need to talk about nutrition anymore. And so I went on a random internet date. I went on a random Hinge date in 2020. And, we were talking about politics or whatever you talk about on a first date. And the guy said, do you know anything about Bitcoin?
Wow, that's such a trick question, I feel. That could go both ways.
I don't remember exactly how it came up. I don't totally remember the context of how he brought it up, but I know that he brought it up. And he sent me a Raoul Pal video over text message afterwards. He was like, you should watch this video.
Great day, by the way.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And for all the men out there who are thinking that they're, orange pilling is going to go, is going to have no impact, sometimes you have an impact. So, so I still talk to this guy. I mean, I think we dated for 6 weeks or something, but now the big joke is that he got me into Bitcoin. I mean, realistically, I'd not be in Bitcoin if it weren't for this random internet date that I went on.
That's wild.
So yeah, so I was there for about 2 years. I was just obsessed, fell down the rabbit hole, watching YouTube, like all of the Michael Sailoring you could possibly do, mostly on YouTube. I was getting most of my information from YouTube for the early days. And I think people really underestimate YouTube, like as a communications channel. Like I think that is really where a lot of normies who are not going to conferences are getting their information. About this space.
Yeah, I feel like YouTube is just in and of itself just like the endless library for anything.
Right. I mean, Twitter is very community oriented, right? You're engaging with other people. It's where you're making social connections around this. But like in terms of just like your average person sitting at home digesting information and learning about the space, I would venture to guess that most of that is happening on YouTube because you have long form content. Like you can actually learn things. You can actually deliver information in much more sophisticated ways. Like who's actually going from 0 to 1 in crypto just from Twitter posts? Probably not that many people, realistically. Twitter's more advanced. It's like level 2, level 3, So I was just like, watching YouTubes all day on Bitcoin. And then eventually I was like, okay, well, I think that this is what I want to do. I want to work in this space. What could I offer? And marketing was the obvious thing, right? That was my skill set. And as a practical matter, people in crypto, I will say actually people in crypto are pretty sophisticated marketers. People in Bitcoin are not.
Interesting.
Yeah. And we can talk about why. I mean, crypto is all about marketing, right? I mean, like that's how you sell a token is through marketing. Marketing is the most important thing that anyone does in crypto, arguably. If you're selling a token, if you're trying to push a token, your head of marketing is the most important person on your team. In Bitcoin, that's not really a thing, right? In Bitcoin, tech is like much more the focus, right? Like, and to some extent marketing, but it's more just about, how well you can communicate why your tech team is so amazing. And that happens in crypto as well. But yeah, I think generally speaking, if you look at like the NFT world, for instance, those are some of the most sophisticated marketers on the planet. None of that exists in Bitcoin. Bitcoin only companies are terrible at marketing, obviously. Right?
Yeah.
They are struggling with adoption, generally speaking. So, yeah.
Just to pause there, is that because there's less money going around in Bitcoin-only companies that you can't attract like those elite marketers? Or is it because Bitcoin itself attracts a different kind of person or a different kind of professional?
I wouldn't say it attracts a different type of person. So number one, the way that investors make money in crypto, and this is going to sound very cynical, but like the way that investors make money is through pumping tokens. And you can pump a small cap token through marketing. There's no like marketing department for Bitcoin. You know what I mean? Like Bitcoin is like, and it's a huge asset in and of itself. Like there's no like marketer that's going to pump Bitcoin, right? Like that's not a thing. Like if you are, I think there are some sophisticated marketers who are working on Bitcoin picks and shovels companies, which is what pretty much all Bitcoin only companies are. They're not pumping tokens by definition. They're picks and shovels companies. They're selling wallets. Maybe they're selling a Bitcoin marketplace like a River or a Swan. Like they're selling actual like products and services, picks and shovel services, which is a totally different thing to do than like pushing an NFT project or pumping a token. Like they're wildly different things. And the marketing department for pushing an NFT or a token, that's where all the money for that thing comes from. That's again, it's the upside potential of a strong marketing campaign if you're pushing a token is just astronomical. Picks and shovels with like a really, really great marketer, it's still, you're kind of like somewhat constrained by, certain people have to be in Bitcoin. They need to like find your product actually useful beyond just like, I think I'm going to make money off of that. It's apples and oranges in terms of what products you're actually marketing, right? So yeah, I think, again, there's talented people who are on the marketing teams of these picks and shovels companies, but it's just nothing compared to, people like, think about like the strongest, NFT creators out there who are like building these communities and the whole product is a marketing product, basically, right? It's how do you mobilize a community to get behind a movement, essentially is what the product is. That's what makes number go up on these NFT projects or these tokens, right? Like, it's all marketing, right? Like, your success is 100% just like, can you rally a community together behind a brand? And, that's very different than like, okay, how do we get more people to like know about multi-sig and use our multi-sig product, or like, choose this wallet over that wallet?
It's so weird because like Bitcoin, it's probably like the most, like the staunchest community, like everybody is super involved. But then at the same time, it's like this counterintuitive, like we don't need marketing because Bitcoin sort of is inedible and sells itself. And so you kind of just like push it away. And at the end of the day, it's just so counterproductive. And then you see Bitcoiners hate on crypto because crypto has these big communities budding because that's where their focus is, which makes total sense. Whereas we're just like these, like I say we, like Bitcoiners, it's just like these sort of islands, and just not interacting with each other, and sort of there's no interconnectivity, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and Bitcoiners, like, they like to be really critical and be like constantly like, kind of playing the devil's advocate, and like that's our personality a little bit, I think. Yeah. So, you go to NFT communities and you start like criticizing a project and people are like, boo, like you're a downer, like, like stop flooding, So yeah, and I think but again, also it's like if you have a marketing job in Bitcoin, you're sort of marketing Bitcoin, but you're really marketing a picks and shovels company that supports the Bitcoin ecosystem,
right?
And those are two different things too, right? Like, people aren't paid to pump Bitcoin, although some marketers think of that as part of their strategy, especially if their company is dependent on onboarding new people to Bitcoin in order to grow their product, user base.
You were head of comms for the Ordinals protocol in the early days.
So I worked for Casey Rodarmor, kind of essentially at like the launch. I wrote like the first press release for the Ordinals protocol under Casey Rodarmor, and then I worked for him for about 6 months thereafter. Yeah.
Would you say that the Ordinals community or the Ordinals ecosystem is sort of flipping that marketing game that's so like common to Bitcoin on its head and bringing over that sort of build the community, better marketing, more attractive, whatever you want to call it? Is that something that you saw and that you continue seeing, or am I lost?
But again, typically what they're marketing is ordinal projects, which is not the same thing as marketing spot. Now, you could make the argument that by marketing ordinal projects, they are sort of de facto getting people into spot. And that is an argument that I have made several times, right? Like, I think, ordinals are net positive in terms of just spot Bitcoin adoption, because in order to buy ordinals, you need to have spot first. Ordinals trade Bitcoin denominated, unlike Ethereum NFTs or Solana, right? Like, any NFT community is de facto adopting whatever the underlying currency of the asset that asset trades on, basically. So adoption of spot Bitcoin is a product of people using ordinals, but the ordinals community by and large is not necessarily trying to convince people to buy spot Bitcoin the way that Bitcoin maxis are. They are, encouraging people to buy ordinals, which, as we know, are a different asset than spot Bitcoin.
Do you want to, because we spoke about this a couple of weeks ago, do you want to tell us the story of like the Ordinals launch? Because you told me that the media industry completely overlooked, or at least the crypto media industry completely overlooked the launch of Ordinals, which is, again, flipped the whole script on what Bitcoin is, what it can do, what's happening. Like, it's even, like, some people are even saying that it's doing like a check on the entire crypto industry as a whole, because now you can do so much more stuff on Bitcoin. What was that story that we, like, as a media industry, overlooked?
Yeah, so something that I think was really interesting to me. So by the time I wrote the first press release for Ordinals, which is when you had like the first actual coverage of ordinals by any media desk, right? Like even Bitcoin Magazine, right? Like they had written an article, I think, before ordinals came out. The now editor-in-chief Bitcoin Magazine, Mark Goodwin, was a good friend of ours, Casey, Aram, we were all friends in San Francisco. And so he had written sort of like a preparatory article about ordinals just from watching Casey build it before it was even live, I believe. But after ordinals went mainnet, there was no coverage of ordinals until well past the point that many, many, many people, and I would call like underground media, Twitter, Discord, etc., knew about ordinals. Ordinals already had the fastest growing Discord server in history before any digital assets company covered it post mainnet launch, which to me is like mind-blowing. Like, who was asleep at the wheel? You know what I mean? Like, who was like not paying attention, right? And
it seems like everybody.
Right. Everyone was asleep at the wheel. And I think that there are lots of reasons for that. I think, obviously we could talk about just like at that time we're in the depths of a bear market. Digital assets media companies are super underfunded, right? I mean, like, that they're underwater trying to keep up with the things that they feel that they have to cover, which by and large are not projects by random independent developers, right? So it's like, unless somebody, probably, they're trying to cover the biggest things in the news or stuff that's being put in their face by publicists, right? Be stuff that's being put in their face by like PR companies, which is mostly stuff not happening in Bitcoin. Like there might be some stuff happening in Bitcoin, and that stuff was probably getting put in front of Bitcoin Magazine. But the vast majority, like we're talking about like the coin desks and the decrypts and the blocks or whatever, the publicists that are putting stuff in those journalists' faces are at that time especially were people coming out of non-Bitcoin digital assets companies, right? Because those are the companies that have money for PR, right? Basically. And, I think just getting into a little bit of the politics of like Bitcoin only versus crypto. A lot of crypto companies, and this is, public, obvious information, a lot of these digital assets media companies are funded by crypto VCs that tend to focus on crypto, not spot Bitcoin related things, right? So you have a lot of media companies, the vast majority of the media companies in the space, I would argue, are biased towards covering things, or have been historically biased towards covering things in the Ethereum, Solana, other layer one ecosystems, because A, that's where they're getting information from publicists that are covering those things that are being paid by those foundations. And B, they themselves are funded by venture capitalists that also have interests in those companies outside of kind of the Bitcoin only ecosystem. Ordinals is changing that. Ordinals, runes, etc. Now we're actually starting to get VC interest in, actual layer one Bitcoin projects, right? VCs are actually putting money into ordinals companies and runes, and these Bitcoin native assets are actually starting to get some venture investment because they see, some opportunities that are more similar to what they were comfortable investing in on the crypto side happening in the Bitcoin ecosystem. And so I do think that that's starting to change, and you're starting to see more Bitcoin coverage for a whole slew of reasons amongst, like publications like, Decrypt or The Block or CoinDesk, et cetera.
Do you think that having VCs, though, might like warp the incentive structure or what coverage is? Because if we're
sure,
then is it necessarily a good thing that VCs are starting to focus on like Bitcoin only? I mean, maybe it's just like a necessary evil or something. Yeah, it is. Yeah,
it's the way it is, right? Like, I mean, the reality of the situation is like money has to come somewhere, and money precedes influence. It's just the reality. Just again, it's sort of. Obviously that works, the incentives from like true neutral journalism, but like these media companies also need to keep their lights on, right? And that's difficult to do. So I think that it just sort of is what it is. And again, even if they were being like super neutral and like could completely self-fund, etc., which some of them can, you still have this like broader institutional problem, like for instance, publicists getting paid. Like publicists get paid by companies that have money, and then the publicists their whole job is to make sure journalists know what they're doing, right? So I think that's, it's a systemic issue, but it just is the way it is. I'm still glad that now there's some financial incentive for people to care about and pay attention to Bitcoin when maybe there was less of that in 2020. Even if the incentives are not neutral, it's better than it was, right? To have, some of that incentive money, financing moving in the direction of Bitcoin.
Is there anything that obviously there must be something that you think you're going to that you would like to see more of in like the media industry, maybe specifically for Bitcoin only? Because at the moment it's like Bitcoin Magazine it seems like the one and only, and then you have like a scattering of podcasters. Maybe like Bitcoin News has popped up a little bit, but it's still like a satellite that just barely exists.
Yeah.
Not casting a shadow like on them, it's just the reality. What do you think is going to happen now that there's more money coming in, if anything is going to happen in the sort of media industry for Bitcoin only?
So the problem with Bitcoin only, Bitcoin Magazine has had a very, very, very lengthy history that wasn't always Bitcoin Magazine, and that's why they are who they are and why they have such a powerful presence. I think if they had started out as a maxi company, right, they would not be who they are today, right? So Bitcoin Magazine is a very special exception in the sense that they sort of became Bitcoin only over time, after already establishing themselves as like a leading player in this space, if not the leading player in the space. Every other publication that's attempted to be Bitcoin only just struggles to survive. Like, how are they making their money? And they don't have Bitcoin maximalists. There's like 10,000 in the world, maybe, people who identify as Bitcoin maximalism. It's a teeny tiny minority of people. It is a very, very, very small percentage of digital assets users. Like it's not a large enough base of people. That's just, again, the reality of the situation, good or bad. It's not a large enough base of people to support a publication, basically. And so you see these Bitcoin only kind of like blogs and publications like attempting to be created, and they just can't survive because they just don't have the circulation to command like advertising and things like that they would need to function, right, to maintain their budget and operations. Ordinals and runes, to answer your question about whether or not that will change things, I don't think so, only because people who are users of ordinals and runes are not typically Bitcoin maximalists. Typically they are interchain, people, multi-chain people who love Bitcoin and love ordinals and love runes, but they would also be happy to go, play with shitcoins on Solana. And so it seems unlikely to me that audience is going to really push for like ordinals only and Bitcoin only content on the internet.
Yeah. Would you like to see that sort of content tossed out more often? Or are you
like Casey content?
Yeah.
I would say like I typically tend to consume Bitcoin content only.
Yeah.
I don't necessarily super care who's creating it, as long as it's Bitcoin, right? Like, that's just what I'm interested in. I'm less interested in learning about Solana or Ethereum, right? Like,
Is there anything, though, in the crypto like side of things that you do ever like dive into?
Like specific publications?
Yeah, or specific stories that might have caught your eye, or something like there's something that's just, this is an interesting topic or a focus.
I'm pretty open-minded when it comes to Bitcoin. I consume a lot of different Bitcoin content. I will say right now, I feel like I've been so immersed in ordinals and runes that I'm almost like, unless it's work-related, I'm like not really paying attention to ordinals and runes right now. I'm like, I need a break. But I've always, been a person who is, I'm very, very interested in anything policy and regulation related, because I just think that the impacts of that on the industry are so enormous. And at the end of the day, that's what I care about, right? Like, what's going to have the biggest impact on Bitcoin adoption? And to some extent, number go up, right? Like, what's best for Bitcoin over time is like kind of what drives my interests. And I would say, I am, fairly interested in sort of technical topics, just because so much of my work, where I've found a lot of personal success in a post-Ordinals universe in particular is communications for Bitcoin technical level protocols. Like a lot of people are doing marketing in digital assets. Not very many of them are really, really strong communicators of technical content, right? To find a really strong marketer who's also good with tech is not easy. And I'm sort of have put in the work and kind of proven myself in that arena a little bit. So I find that I'm encouraged, right, to go deeper and do more technical communications type of stuff. And then mining. I love mining. I love everything related to Bitcoin mining. I mean, I'm like a nerd. It's not even nerdy. I feel like mining is sexy. Like, I feel like if you know, like mining is what's sexy.
Yeah, mining is brilliant.
Yeah.
And once you dive into like the actual mining ecosystem and how it works, it's just such a mind fuck.
Yeah.
You know, like all these different pieces coming together and how it balances the grid and just like shooting random like numbers at the wall and seeing what sticks and just all this sort of, how it all comes together. It's just an amazing industry. And
Totally.
And I think that's one of the things that I'm always baffled by when it comes to, so, for example, like the whole conversation of like Bitcoin versus crypto, and especially like Bitcoin versus crypto reporting, or like the media industry as well, how there's this sort of pervasive idea that Bitcoin mining is bad for the environment and it's just one of the wrong things that's wrong with Bitcoin and we need to do this. And it's so frustrating because it's completely the opposite way of how it should be.
Yeah.
And like how it gets reported. And I saw it, like I've seen it when I've been at Decrypt, before that at Finder, like at the Defiant. There's this like this whole mindset, and something that
I see Bitcoin FUD.
Yeah. And I was diving, for example, on Laura Shin's website the other day, and I ran across, she's looking for a Bitcoin specific reporter, like a Bitcoin focused reporter. Do you think that that's a role that every publication should have?
I think it's a role that every publication will have and is probably trying to fill right now because of Ordinals and Runes. Now, I don't think they're looking for Bitcoin only. I don't think they're looking for maxi people. Let's just be clear. But they're looking for somebody who is familiar and competent about Bitcoin, right? Like you talk to like a lot of like journalists in the space, in the crypto space, like they couldn't tell you with a gun to their head what a UTXO is. Right. So, and now, Ordinals, Runes, like they're not maximalists who are necessarily using these technologies, but like these are Bitcoin native technologies, and you need to understand how Bitcoin works if you're going to cover them well. And so I think that a lot of publications are right now scrambling for people who can cover those topics in a competent way, because a lot of these publications, that's not been a requirement for work, because they don't cover Bitcoin technical topics hardly ever prior to Ordinals and Runes.
How important do you think it is to properly understand Bitcoin to properly understand a lot of stuff in crypto? So,
it not that much, and the reason for it sort of depends. I will say one of the best pieces of advice I ever got when I was learning about like how crypto actually works technically. Somebody said to me, if you want to learn how any blockchain works, understand how Bitcoin works first, because it's in many ways the most simple, elegant blockchain that there is. And I think that's very true, right? Like if you want to understand how Ethereum blockchain works under the hood, understanding how Bitcoin blockchain works first, probably a good stepping stone. That being said, most people who are covering crypto ecosystems outside of Bitcoin don't really even need to know that much about how blockchains work, because their definition, right, in these other ecosystems, building on Ethereum, building on Solana, that mostly means building on EVM or SVM or these VMs, these virtual machines that are on top of the actual blockchains themselves, right? So that is also just in and of itself like a huge mental model shift in terms of understanding the technology. Like when you're building on Ethereum, usually, not always, but usually people who are building on Ethereum are like EVM developers, right? Like they're developers building on a virtual machine, which is very, very different than like working with Ordinals or Runes, where you're actually like executing like Bitcoin transactions on like within like a UTXO set on the blockchain itself. Like it's a totally different type of technology, very, very different technology. And so I would say, yeah, like most reporters in the digital asset space who were covering crypto before didn't really need to know how the Ethereum blockchain worked under the hood, like underneath the VM, because when most of the coverage was happening of applications that are just sort of happening at sort of EVM layer, which is a totally different thing.
Yeah. I want to go back for a second and talk about because you worked at Decrypt in the early days.
Yes.
What was that like?
I mean, they at that time, they were a very Ethereum, and they still are to a certain extent, but less so, right? Like now they're having to learn more about Bitcoin because of runes and ordinals, and that those technologies are there's a lot of interest in those technologies from their readers, who are historically, and certainly when I was working on there was a ton of focus on NFTs when I was working. I mean, I was working at Decrypt at like the height of the NFT boom of the last cycle. NFTs were a huge focus of Decrypt at that time. NFTs, DeFi, Ethereum, all of these other kind of crypto-focused technologies was the focus. They would, because that was Bitcoin loosely, but I think it was mostly like major news items, MicroStrategy related things that the mainstream media would probably cover about Bitcoin. All-time highs, we always covered all-time highs in Bitcoin, but most of the kind of more smaller stories were stories that were happening in other ecosystems.
Yeah, because that was like 2021, 2022, like height of the so-called DeFi summer. So obviously that's where the focus.
DeFi and NFTs was the primary focus of Decrypt at that time.
Yeah.
And also remember, like Decrypt was a consensus company. It was incubated by Consensus, which is the Ethereum, which is the sort of business arm of Ethereum. So, that's just, again, a reality of the situation. I think, again, that's also changed because at some point, the incubate. When I got to Decrypt, it was right when they were kind of getting kicked out of the incubation nest, so to speak, right? Like they were independent, they'd been incubated, they were expected to go off and kind of make their own money, and they weren't being funded by Consensus the same way, and they were just getting their sea legs coming out of the Consensus incubator when I was working there.
What was that experience like then, to sort of like lose the training wheels and just start to have to pedal by themselves?
I mean, I think there was, it's like anything. I think there was, I wasn't like on the, super deep in the management side of things. So I couldn't really tell you what was going on at that level. But I imagine, it was, okay, yeah, we got to figure out how to make money. I remember they hired me to kind of manage marketing because I think they were trying to figure out how do we make money. We need real streams of revenue right now, which is not easy for publications to do. It's an ongoing struggle in any industry, right? Publishing is just a hard industry in terms of revenue generation. So that's one of the reasons that they brought me on board was, they wanted to, I think at that time they had a couple kind of like online products and services that they were trying to market. And my previous experience, online marketing, online education products made a lot of sense. And that was technically my first job in crypto.
Did you get any say in the editorial side of things, or were you always just mainly marketing? And
no, I was 100% marketing. I had no say in the editorial, and I didn't ask for that. I mean, it wasn't something I was angling for.
Right.
I was, there to do a job and prove myself, and trying to get my feet wet in the industry. Again, my first job ever. I did notice though that definitely, the focus was certainly on the Ethereum ecosystem first and foremost. And that the relationships that, most of the management team had were very, strong relationships in that ecosystem. So they had sort of an edge in covering those topics. And, that was, again, it just sort of was, I think that's sort of how publishing works, right? At the end of the day, there's really no such thing as like neutral journalism. Journalists are covering what they have, the information that they have access to.
Yeah, I was going to ask exactly that, because it's such a tough balance, isn't it? Like monetizing and like keeping a publication alive, but then delivering say, neutral reporting or investigations or like deep dives or things that are sometimes anti to the people that are like funding you. And it's such a hard balance, isn't it, at the end of the day? And I wonder if there's ever going to be that sort of balance, you know?
I don't think it will exist. I just don't. The question is how, right? I mean, then you start to get into like grants. I mean, you know, you start to really like pull your, like, is there such a thing as neutrality in general? I've sort of come to the point where philosophically, I just don't think there are, right? Like neutrality is a spectrum. And it's a spectrum that's defined by the incentives involved, right? But there's always going to be incentives, right? Like as long as you have money and people are getting paid, like there's some, you know, clear path as to like where that money is coming from, how it's being, you know, generated.
Do you think people like readers understand that? Do you think like a reader or somebody who's, or a listener, whoever like sees an article or watches a show understands like the incentives at play, or that this might be biased in some sort of direction? Or do you think there's this inherent sort of, obviously unfounded, but this inherent sort of idea that journalism is neutral and that's it, and what they're telling me is how it is, and there's no like external or like channeling of anything inside?
I think it's all over the map. I think you have some readers who are like really sophisticated, who like really sort of understand like the nuances of how an industry works. I think you have some people who just like read things and just like accept them at face value. I think you also see like the opposite extreme of the readers who accept things at face value, which you're seeing a lot of right now in politics, which is like, I don't trust anyone, which I think the impacts of that are that you're seeing people more start to trust lifestyle, independent human being media companies more than corporate entities, right? I think you're seeing a movement of consumers in the direction of wanting to get their content from specific influencers than companies or publishing organizations, things like that. And I think that trend's going to continue. I think that there is a distrust of organizations, and people are moving more in the direction of trusting people, which is not, you know, I mean, the reality of the situation is people are companies too, right? Yeah. I mean, like it's not that different, but there's something emotional, I think, where people are starting to prefer to get their information from people that they trust more than companies, even though, again, at the end of the day, I don't necessarily think that that's better. It's usually not, actually.
Yeah. Let's say you were starting out as starting a media company, or starting to like put out content, or whether that's written, or what would you do to sort of create that level or some sort of trust or some sort of, that connection with
humanize your brand, right? I mean, and you're starting to see companies get hip to that. And I think that's what like smart marketers are encouraging companies to do, right? Is like, how do you humanize your company? How do you create, you know, faces of your company? And you're seeing this. This is not new, right? Like every, you know, product out there, if they're at all hip to marketing at all, will have somebody at the company who's like the face of the company, who's humanizing the brand. Writing marketing emails that are actually signed by a human being, you know, and are just like corporate from the company, right? Writing marketing emails in human language and human voice, having a tone, sounding like a human being is very important when you're tweeting or emailing, you know, because I think, you know, and you still see like, you know, kind of more beginner marketers or people, you know, just companies that are new and don't really know what's going on. They'll think it's important to like sound professional. Like, well, actually sounding professional is like a bug, not a feature, you know? Like what you want to do if you're smart with marketing is sound like a human being that's like somebody's friend that they can connect to. Like that's how you create trust with consumers.
Yeah, it's funny. I was thinking, well, I had two examples that came to mind, which was like this whole rebranding that Mark Zuckerberg's had, who went from like alien to like Gen Z, sort of tanned and curly hair, and sort of like coming down from his tech ivory tower and just like trying to interact with regular people.
Yeah.
And then I was thinking also like CrowdStrike, that their CEO came out on Twitter and he was just like super drabby and just like doom, 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 instead of actually being like, we fucked up, or we made this, or we made that.
Right.
Like,
even the royal family, right? Like, there's a reason why people are obsessed with like Meghan Markle or like Princess Diana, it's because they were more human, they were more relatable, they were more accessible, right? This has been going on for a long time.
How do you think that ties into, like, for example, journalism, though? Because journalism has that. Yeah, exactly.
It's a problem because, yeah, I mean, you have an issue where it's like journalists who are again, I don't think neutrality exists, but I think that there are people who are like putting a lot of effort into doing their best to be ethical, neutral journalists to the extent that they are able, and those are precious, right? Like, those people are precious, and they should be the people that are the most trusted. But how do they communicate that to your average reader, that they are that person? Very difficult to do.
Yeah.
Most readers don't realize who that person is at all.
Yeah, it's funny because there's a couple times recently that I've had somebody send me an article like that I wrote, thinking this is because I wrote it. And I was like, oh, thank you for reading my stuff. And they're like, I had no idea you had written it. I just thought it was interesting, and it was like in your ballpark of interest, and that's why I sent it.
Mm-hmm.
And so at the end of the day, yeah, people are just like reading the headlines and then reading the article itself, but then that sort of flies in the face of this idea of like, how do we humanize this, or how do we like bring it down so that the person talks to the person?
It's a problem. I mean, this is a problem not just in crypto, obviously. I mean, this is a major. We have a information distribution problem brought on by the internet, right? There's so many amazing things that come from the internet, and then there's a lot of challenges, and one of them is the internet is sort of designed to amplify like really divisive voices, really entertaining voices, all of these things that like if you go to journalism school, like you're trying not to be, right? You're trying to like kind of keep it together and be like a neutral voice. The problem.
Is there anything that you think that as a journalist, whether that's Bitcoin, whether that's crypto, whether that's traditional, is doing right? Or is anything or anybody that you think like, oh yeah, I like that work, or I like...
I mean, I appreciate that like there is still journalism integrity in the world. Like journalistic integrity does still exist, I mean, we were talking about Andre Bagansky the other day. Like he's a really good example. We talk about this all the time privately, right? Like he's like, like the folks at Decrypt, for instance, like most of them have journalistic training. They're actual journalists. And I think they are generally, obviously there's, all of these things going on in the background in terms of like who they're connected to and where they're getting information. But for the most part, they are trained to practice certain like codes of conduct that they learned in school about journalistic ethics, and I think that that's really important. The problem is how do you get readers to care about that, and how do you educate readers to know what that looks like and who those people are, and help readers understand where their information is coming from, etc. That's the challenge, and I don't know the answer to that.
Yeah, and I feel like that's getting even worse, and it's only spiraling more out of control because nowadays you've got fake news on one, like deep fakes on one side of things, but then you've got sources that are just either lying out of their teeth or also like warped incentives. And so how do you, like, as a journalist, sometimes I try to keep it as like, go to the source, but even sometimes then I'm just like, am I completely sure that what they're saying is how it is, or how it's coming, or did I miss something that was like quintessential to the story, and then that needs to be added in?
And everyone's overworked, right? And everyone's writing 5 stories a day, and
underpaid.
They're the most underpaid, overworked group of people on the planet. So it's hard. It's really hard. I don't know. I don't have an answer to these. I know I can identify the issues, but I don't know what the answers are.
Do you think, this might sound like an odd question, but do you think journalists get enough credit for the work that they do?
No, not at all. Not at all. I mean, you have the people who are getting the credit for things that journalists write are, influencers who are reading headlines and then spewing about them on their blogs or their YouTube channels, and they get all the praise and all the oh my gosh, so-and-so such a genius. So no, yeah, I do not think that they get enough credit.
Where do you place influencers on all this Because like I was thinking about, and I was chatting to Liz Napolitano, who's at Decrypt Now, yesterday about like the idea of KOLs and like the fact that like influencers have like a self-appointed acronym that's a KOL, you know, key opinion leaders, and just like, where do you think that they play a role in all of this? Do you think that they're net good, net bad, net neutral?
I mean, I'm leaning in the direction of saying net neutral only because there's so much good and so much bad, and like maybe it all cancels each other out. You know what I mean? Like,
because you're on record, so
it's like a real hodgepodge. You know, I mean, like on the one end, right? Like what these KOLs, key opinion leaders, influencers are doing is like they're megaphones. They're that's maybe a better way of thinking about it. Like they're tools, right? Like they have a function. And their function is to amplify megaphone information. The question is what information are they amplifying? And that could be truthful information. That could be information that was sourced ethically. That could be disinformation. I mean, it could be anything, right? They are just, sort of like asking the question, like, is Twitter good or bad? Or is YouTube good or bad? Is the internet good or bad, right? It's neither. They're just amplifiers, and the distinction between good or bad in that context is what are they amplifying?
Yeah. How much of the information that you read or consume do you question? Like when you read an article or watch a podcast or see a headline, how much of it is, I'm like slowly leaning towards, and I mean, I'm a natural skeptic, but like I feel like I'm getting even more, and everything that I see or read, there's like a part of me that's like, is this staged? Like, is this true? Is this not? You had the same thought process when you ran across it.
I think there are certain things that we can do to educate ourselves as readers in terms of being able to like parse out like, okay, and there's a lot of like work being done right now to do like internet reader literacy education, right? So meaning like, when you're reading something, first off, can you identify what in the article is a fact, or at least presenting to be a fact? Like it's a statistic, it's a number, you know, it is, you know, something that is like a happening that's verifiable in some universe of truth, right? Versus an opinion, right? Like just basic things like that, right? Like versus, you know, if somebody says like, oh, well, you know, Bitcoin's really been criticized for being bad, you know, for its impacts on the environment. That doesn't mean anything to me, because it's like, what impacts? What are you talking about? Let's get more specific. Like, what are you saying? Somebody who doesn't have, if you're not reader literate, you might be like, oh, apparently Bitcoin's bad for the environment. But if you can start to like learn how to read articles and just pick out very, very basic things, like what is actually like a fact and what is an opinion, even that will help you a lot, right? Like, when you're reading these things. I think it gets more complicated when you start to get into like, okay, the facts, are they actually facts?
Yeah.
Especially with things like statistics. Statistics are the facts that are the most questionable, right? Are the most like, where did that number come from? You know? And so, yeah, I think that there are people out there who are really focused, who basically believe that the only way to solve this problem is through reader literacy like initiatives, right? Like teaching children at young ages how to discern the difference between facts and opinions, and how to be questioning things, especially of things like statistics, where you're most likely to get factual inaccuracies, right? Kind of thing.
I remember reading that there's, I don't know if it's Denmark or it's Finland or one of those countries that's putting in like digital literacy courses in schools and in universities, just because, yeah, fake news, disinformation is just such a big concern.
How else do you combat it? I mean, like, there's really no other way other than censorship, which I am staunchly opposed to, because then it draws the question of who is deciding what to censor. Is centralization problems. The only, from what I can tell, the only way to at all address disinformation is literacy education, right? Is reader literacy education, because, yeah, that's the only decentralized way to address it. Everything else is a centralized solution.
But do you reckon it's enough? Because then it becomes just sort of like, well, yeah. Because at the end of the day, if you have, I mean, even if you have a reader who's critical thinking, understands sources, understands facts, understands like discerning what's problem. It's still a problem because like how much pressure can they exert on a publication at the end of the day? Especially like, I don't know, thankfully in crypto and in Bitcoin, we do have like, it's very online Twitter based. So you do have, if anything happens, you have this like huge momentum of people and pressure that sort of can force changes, or at least whether that's,
for big topics that people know about, where you have enough people of a, different understanding of what happened. Yeah.
Yeah, but I don't like. I'm not sure if that happens in any other industry. I mean, I can completely.
Oh, it definitely does. It definitely does. I mean, in politics, it definitely. I mean, I think in any industry where you have a large group of people on the internet talking to each other, you're going to have debates about stuff.
Yeah, I guess that makes sense. I guess maybe I'm just too far in the weeds of this industry. And I always think of it as so small that like a small little ripple can create just like a huge effect. Whereas other industries, I just consider them.
Industries are smaller, right? They're so small that like, there might not be as much of an active Twitter presence in some of these other industries where you do have very strong Twitter, like community engagement happening in crypto.
How dangerous do you think that Twitter is for whether that's disseminating information, whether that's and like, for example, creating community? Is it the right kind of community that we're trying to create? If there is a right or wrong or whatever you want to call it, like, because Twitter is the ultimate platform, especially in our industry. And I'm always baffled by it and just look at it sort of, is this what we're trying to create, trying to emulate? Because then, like, we're at Bitcoin 2024, and now you're getting all these people who fight on Twitter and who complain on Twitter, and it's just like super aggressive and violent. And then here you are all in one place, just like, kumbaya. Yeah. It's so bizarre, isn't it?
Yeah. I mean, yeah, people are more likely to be, and there's I believe some good research to back this up. People are more likely to be, I don't know if aggressive is the right word, but like impolite. I mean, that might be too weak of a word.
Yeah.
People are more likely to act like trolls on the internet, where they can kind of protect themselves, right? Where they can be, at the very least pseudonymous, or even if they're not pseudonymous. I mean, like, I find myself being more aggressive on the internet, and I'm not pseudonymous at all. I'm like full doxed. I know I piss people off on the internet, and it's weird. You do feel like more emboldened when you're behind the safety of a screen. And so I think that's real.
Yeah. I feel like Twitter has just become this sort of, at least for me, I've made a lot of friends through it, but then at the same time, it's just such a cesspool of just like, yeah.
You also like miss other people's humanity. Like, you feel more protected. Like, you can kind of like be nuts on the internet, and like it's not as likely to backfire on you. But I think on the other side, it's easy to dehumanize other people on the internet who are just like sitting there behind their screen names or whatever. Like, you forget that you're talking to like a real human sometimes when you're saying things on the internet.
Yeah, no, totally. Is there anything that you've discovered on Twitter, for example, that you would have never expected? Like, for example, like some sort of odd story or some odd character, aside from the guy that like might have sent you that video, although that's like the Raoul Pal story. But is there anything online that, maybe taking it back to some story that broke that you're like, holy fuck, I can't believe I discovered this through I'm just always fascinated by the idea of like how the internet can just create these strange stories that come our way, especially working with something as bizarre as Bitcoin or crypto. I'm intrigued by what people discover online.
I don't necessarily know if it's what I discover online that's so crazy so much as the speed with which I discover it. That's really mind-blowing, right? I mean, it's just instant, everything. And I think Twitter is the platform arguably where that is most true, right? Like, if something happens in the world, Twitter is actually probably where it will be broken first. That is just a reality of the situation. And I think Twitter sometimes doesn't necessarily get enough credit for that.
Do you think the news creates itself or Twitter creates the news?
I think a lot of journalists, or my understanding from talking to journalists, a lot of journalists get their best scoops from Twitter.
Yeah.
I mean, that is my understanding of a lot of the journalists that I know in the digital assets world and beyond, is that like their first thing they do when they wake up in the morning is they like have their, their Twitter, they're checking Twitter. But no, I think that there are just things that are newsworthy.
Yeah.
Right. I think newsworthiness is real. And Twitter doesn't choose what's newsworthy. Twitter just amplifies what's newsworthy, and it helps journalists understand where the consensus is around what's newsworthy.
Yeah,
because it is a place where you have immediate consent. It's like you can market test a story on Twitter before you write it.
Yeah, it's crazy how it has that immediate feedback loop to anything. Like you put it out and then you immediately know if it's a hit, if it's a huge mistake, if it's going anywhere. It's wild.
Yes. Yeah. Yes.
There's been so many times where I've published something on Twitter, like a story, and I'm just like, what the fuck is going to happen next? And sometimes it just falls and flops, and sometimes it just goes mad and goes completely spirals out of control.
Yeah.
It feels like such a untested landmine all of the time, and people are just like constantly waiting for something.
It's like impossible for like your average man to really know. It's like market speculation, like which stories are going to pop, right? It really is. Like you could put bets on it. Yeah. It's a form of market speculation. Like how are humans going to respond to a particular story? And some people are really good at that game. Some people are really good at knowing how humans are going to respond. Some people are terrible at it, right? So it's like trading.
Wow.
Like, you're, I think, really, really successful journalists, especially in the internet age. And Andre Baganski is a really good example of this. Like, he's like a person who I would say is like above average in understanding what people want to know and understanding like what stories are going to work and even like what titles of what stories are going to work. Like, he's good at that. And I think that that's like a skill. And I think it's like an intuition that some people are probably predisposed to at birth.
Yeah. We're coming up on time, and so I always end the conversation with books. I like to read a lot, and I find it's always fascinating to figure out or hear what other people usually read or like to recommend. And so for you, Isabel, the question I always ask is, what are you reading now? And then what do you usually recommend? Whether it can be Bitcoin related, it can be like fiction, it can be whatever you want. But if there's a specific book that maybe that doesn't have to be you always recommend it, but that you've been recommending lately. Yeah.
Okay. So what I'm reading right now is like History of a Stock Market Operator, I think is what it's called. And it's like a classic trading book that like probably some people who are watching this who are into trading might know because it's like very famous, and I feel like I'm like late to the game on reading it, and I just started it, so I can't share too much detail, but it's like memoir style about a very successful trader, I think in like the 20s. And books that I recommend all the time. It's a really hard question. Not in Bitcoin or in Bitcoin?
It doesn't, I mean, whichever way you want to go.
In Bitcoin. I mean, so the book, so there's my favorite book in the world is like this Tibetan Buddhist book called When Things Fall Apart that like, it's like constantly, I'm always recommending it. That's like my go-to since I was in my early 20s. I always recommend that book. It's just like a strong, like how to stay sane in a crazy world kind of book. And then I would say, and then I think that's probably where I'll leave it. I mean, I feel like the obvious Bitcoin books are like the obvious Bitcoin books. So I won't be boring. So, yeah.
That's a great way to end it then, I suppose. Thank you so much as well. This has been a lot of fun, and there's a lot of food for thought. You gave me a lot to think about afterwards.
Good.
Yeah.
Oh, so bad. I could nerd out all night about that.
All right.